Hello and welcome back. Or if you're just joining for the first time, welcome. This is Family History with Chris. I am Chris, and I'd like to introduce you to a couple more pioneers, my fourth great grandparents on my dad's side, Coleman and Melinda Boren. Uh, if you can see right here, here's a picture, nice looking person, and then this is Melinda right here. Um, and thank you to the information or the Boren Family Association for this information. They had posted a 8 pages worth. As I was reading through it, is a lot of information uh, and a lot of interesting facts there. So let's just get to it. Coleman Boren was born on October 13, 1808, in Robertson County, Tennessee. His parents were Basil Boren and Susanna Bryant. His father died when he was only 4 years old. It is sad that we do not know more about the Coleman's young life. He would have been alive during the War of 1812. It was 1811 that the first steamboat left Pittsburgh on its way down to the Ohio River to the Mississippi. Coleman was only 10 years old when Illinois became a state. We do not know what Coleman was. We do know that Coleman was an excellent shot with the bow and arrow. His daughter told of how her father, when they first came to Provo, went out hunting with one arrow and usually brought home a deer or something. Melinda Keller, picture right here, born 9th of October 1812 or 1813, and was the daughter of Abraham and Sarah Hinkle Keller. The Rowan Company North Carolina marriage bonds show that Abraham Keller married Sarah Hinkle on April 13, 1809. Abraham Keller was buying and selling land on the forks of the Yadkin River until July 31st, 1824. Then he seems to have decided to sell out and move to Nashville, Tennessee. Just when the family moved to Illinois is uncertain. Melinda Keller, at the age of 16, went to her first dance or ball, as they say were called then. She wore her first voile, I don't know how to say that, voile dress, and her fine shoes. At this ball, she met Coleman Boren at the age of 16. 1 year later, 7th of March 1830, they were married at Jonesboro, Illinois. So she was 17 when she got married. Okay. Uh, the first years of marriage have been extra trying for Melinda and Coleman. Their first child was born 27th day of July 1831 at Jonesboro, Illinois. They named him John Riley, born only 3 days before the birth of their second child. Only 3 days before the birth of their second child, 2-year-old. Oh, okay. Sorry, I have to continue reading. 2-year-old John Riley died. Baby Sally only lived 2 short weeks. The sisterly love of Temperance was very needed, and she came and lived with them during this sorrowful time. From the McCracken County, Kentucky records, let's see, it says, dated 28th of August, 1827, Matthew Waters Jr. had consent with Morin was of age. I do hereby certify that I did, on the 23rd day of September, 1827, solemnize the rights of matrimony between Matthew Waters and Morin Boren, according to law, given under the hands of one of the justices of the peace, to solemnize the rights of matrimony. Signed, Jesse Doolin. One report states that Mornin died, while another simply said that a man from Kentucky who had lost his wife brought little Patsy, or Martha Ann Waters, okay, I think I'm related to her, to live and be raised by Melinda and Coleman. On Sally's birthday, October 24th, 1835, His son, they called Basil, was born. There seems to be no information about him except the death date of January 2nd, 1855. William Jasper Boren arrived next on 29th of November, 1837, in the town of Peoria, Illinois, followed by Susanna on November 24th, 1839, in Jonesboro, Illinois. Coleman's life is changed greatly at this time, for in the fall of 1839, Zachariah Wilson arrived in southern Illinois. He came preaching with the new ideas of a different kind of church. The doctrines taught must have appealed to Coleman, and he was baptized on January 3rd, 1840. Thank you, Zachariah Wilson. Coleman arrived in Nauvoo, Illinois, sometime during the year of 1842. Minerva was born on January 31st, 1842, at Jonesboro, Illinois, and yet on the Nauvoo tax list of 1842, Coleman Boren is listed with the following: 70 cattle, 130 horses, 285 property in Block 35. This is 6 blocks north of the temple site and bound by Wells Street, Durfee Street, Carlo Street, and Hiram Street. Coleman was ordained into the 21st Quorum of the 70 at Nauvoo in April of 1845 and was a church member of the Nauvoo Legion. He was a lieutenant according to the militia records in the church historian's office. Okay, so that's cool. So if I ever go to Nauvoo, I can go find that spot and say, hey, my fourth great grandparents lived there. On February 2nd, 1846, Brigham Young told the saints to stop working on the temple and prepare to leave Nauvoo. However, on the following morning, when Brigham Young arrived at the temple, a large group of saints were waiting to receive their endowments. He expressed the concern that the brethren would have us stay here and continue the endowments until our way would be hedged up and our enemies would intercept us. He tried to remind them of the blessings they had already received by obeying the commandments and finishing the temple, and they would build other temples in the promised land. So Brigham Young already knew this. They should move westward before their families were killed by they refused to go until they had received their own endowments. This is one of the few times the saints would not be swayed by him. When he turned away, they did not follow him. Brigham Young returned, and 295 endowments were completed that cold, wintry day of February 3rd, 1846. The names of Coleman and Melinda Boren are found there. Melinda had become baptized a member of the church 2 years prior. A granddaughter of Temperance Keller Penrod, Melinda's sister, wrote, when they arrived at the Missouri River, some of the saints who had started the journey with ill-prepared wagons and outfits were held up at the river, their wagons broken in different places. Most of the trouble was with the wheels and tires. Grandfather was asked to remain there to repair wagons so the saints could continue their journey west. Great wisdom was shown by the church leaders in establishing settlements with large farms to house, organize, and equip them physically, mentally, and spiritually for the journey across the plains. The first such location was called Garden Grove, about 150 miles west of Nauvoo. Then next was Mount Pisgah, Mount Pisgah, which Parley P. Pratt described the beauty and harmony of an English park. This is where Coleman Boren and his family stayed and repaired wagons. Here it is recorded that there were 160 deaths in the first 6 months. During this time, Coleman and Melinda added 3 children to their family: Joseph Smith Boren on February 8th, 1845 in Nauvoo, Illinois, Lorana on 27th of June, 1847, and Coleman Bryant Boren on December 29th, 1849. Both were born at Mount keep on wanting to say Mount Pigsaw, but it's Mount Pisgah, Iowa. There's now a family with seven. There is now a family with 7 children to feed, clothe, and bring west. It is a coincidence that Coleman, one of the early settlers of Jonesboro, Union County, Illinois, was also one of the first people settling in Jones Township, Union County, Iowa. Sometime during that year of 1850, Coleman took as his second and plural wife Flora Maria Kingsley. She was born May 27th, 1827, at Bridgewater, Susquehanna County, Pennsylvania, a daughter of Ezra and Margaret Kingsley. Her father joined the church while Joseph Smith was living in Susquehanna County. The family had moved to Nauvoo, and Flora Maria received her endowments in the Nauvoo Temple. February 6, 1846, she married a man named Hughes and bore one child called Ross Burton Hughes. He was born on January 1st or 21st, 1847, at Mount Pisgah, Iowa, and died June 17th, 1875, in Heber City. It is assumed that Mr. Hughes died of cholera, but there is no proof. It is said Coleman Boren came to know Flora Maria through her sister Urania, who married Jacob Young. Jacob Young had died, leaving these two young sisters without protection. Coleman took both into his home. The first child born of this union between Coleman and Flora was Josephine Melinda Boren, born May 1851 at Mount Pisgah. Coleman Boren and his large family came to Utah in 1851. Although particular company is unknown, the trip west was a long and hazardous one. William Jasper drove his father's sheep the entire distance, and he was only 14 years old at the time. Coleman left the east with the 3 wagons, 11 oxen, 3 cows, and the sheep. They started with plenty of food and clothes, but gave a large part away to those who were in need. The women and small children took turns riding in the wagons amid their various possessions, as well as the prized saplings, which later made Coleman the father of a peach industry in Utah County. The journey west was not without mishaps. According to the stories handed down by different members of the family, one day the cattle stampeded. The oxen became frightened and bolted. Urania, Flora's sister, jumped or fell from the wagon and was run over by the wheels. She lived only a few hours. Flora was very upset, so Melinda brought her own wedding dress, then cared for and dressed the body, and they buried her along the trail. Another time, upon rising one morning, Coleman discovered the oxen had strayed. At first, it was feared that the Indians had stolen them, but after 2 days of searching, they found them unharmed. They were traveling so late in the season that they encountered all types of weather, hot and dry to extreme frost and snow and sparse feed. David and Temperance Keller Penrod had arrived in Utah 1849 in the Orson Hyde County in the Orson Hyde Company, and had moved on to Provo and to Fort Utah during the 1850 Indian Trouble. When it was again safe, they took an adobe house between 3rd and 4th West on Center Street in Provo. Coleman and Melinda bought property nearby between 1st and 2nd South, just off Center Street. The settlers were having some trouble with the Indians, and on July 17th, 1853, real trouble started. Some Indians were camped at Spring Creek, about a half mile from the cabin of James Ivy. An Indian and squaw from the camp came to do some trading. They had 3 trout, and Mrs. Ivy only gave the squaw a small amount of flour, and this angered the Indian brave. He struck the squaw and entered the cabin. Mr. Ivy pushed him out in the fight that followed, hit the Indian over the head with a broken gun barrel. Two other Indians had been watching from the bushes, and one joined the fight and was also injured. The other one returned to camp to tell what we had seen. The first Indian died, and Mr. and Mrs. Ivy and their child headed for town. Chief Walker demanded that Mr. Ivy be given to the Indians. Bishop Aaron Johnson of Springfield offered blankets and beef as well as flour, but the Indians would not be appeased, and so started the Walker War. At this time, Coleman, who belonged to the Nauvoo Legion, had his commission transferred to the Utah Militia. On the 10th of July, Colonel Peter W. Conover of Provo, hearing of the outbreak, took force of men south toward Manti for Chief Walker's main camp, which was in the command with his own company of mounted rangers. Richard Ivy, captain of the company of infantry, and Coleman Boren as captain of the cavalry. Colonel George A. Smith was given command of all the militia in Utah Territory south of Salt Lake Valley. The people were told not to take offensive or retaliate against the Indians, but go to the forts and wait. However, if the Indians were caught attempting to steal or kill, appropriate punishment would be given. About the last of July, a band of Indians made a raid upon the outskirts of Provo, near Provo Bench, where Coleman owned farmland, and were off with a large herd of cattle. The cattle they did not take, they slaughtered and left to rot. Whether any of the animals belonged to Coleman is not recorded, but he and his company were dispatched by Major Wall to pursue and recover the lost stock, if at all possible. It was assumed that 15 Indians were raiding, so Captain Boren mustered only 10 men and a wagon outfitted with supplies and equipment with Peter W. Conover as teamster. Each man brought his own horse, and Coleman took two. The actual activities of the first 10 days are unknown. They arrived on Willow Creek at Mona on August 10th and found everything in a tremolo. Lieutenant R. Brund and his detached had in his detachment had been attacked by the Indians and had been forced to fight from behind their mounts. Two of the horses had been killed, and Isaac Duffin had a wound in the knee. At least one Indian was dead, and a supposed massacre on the detachment had been averted by arrival of Captain Boren leading his cavalry. While Coleman was off chasing Indians, Melinda was giving birth to Nathan Alma on August 4th, 1853. Flora Maria had a son on January 17th, 1853. Followed a year later by Henry Kingsley Boren on January 5th, 1854. With the enlarging of his family, Coleman must have felt the need to work more land and seemed to have gone into partnership with Richard Smith and James Smith. Coleman's family again increased with the birth of Ephraim DeClave to Melinda on August 7th or 17th, 1856, and Albert Boone born to Flora on September 21st, 1855 or 56, with two wives and so many children, four plus Flora plus a 9-year of Ross Hughes. There are now 9 children by Melinda and Patsy, or Martha Ann, had married and had children, so Coleman could be acting as the grandfather. The only one of his own children to marry during his lifetime was at this time as Susanna married John Jones on July 24th, 1856. To provide for this family, Coleman must have worked very hard, yet he was grievous, or a very generous man. Lucina Jasper's wife said in her journal, Coleman never turned anyone away. If they could not pay, he let them have it without pay. I have heard people say he saved them from starvation. It is said he took more wheat out of his granary than he put in. His son William Coleman tells this story. Some during the year of 1856, a party of men stopped in Provo seeking food supplies. They had not been able, they said, to obtain the provisions needed in the Salt Lake City. This delegation of men from the California-bound wagon train approached Coleman and asked to purchase. I'm sorry, I'm having a hard time reading. My eyes are getting watery. This delegation of men from the California-bound wagon train approached Coleman and asked to purchase some of the grain or flour, and Coleman refused to sell any of it. The men became quite indignant, and protested loudly, saying, "Why will you not sell any to us? You certainly have enough to it." Coleman merely replied, "No, the poor around us need it, and I will keep it for them." The men badly in need of provisions persist. "How much will you sell the flour for to the poor?" Yes, Coleman replied, $3 a hundred, if they can pay for it. If it is the same as they paid for it last year. "We'll give you 5, the men offered, and Coleman refused. The men consulted privately and came back again, 10, and said they were refused. Their final offer was leveled. "We will give you $24 a hundred for it, and not a penny more we can spare." Then Coleman replied, "Sir, the flour and the wheat are not for sale to you at any price. The good people of the city are starving, and they shall have it for $3 or for nothing at all." The men went away quiet, mad without satisfaction. It's kind of fun. Coleman owned 2 homes in Provo City and one at the Provo Bench near his orchard. The 2 city homes were in residence of his 2 families. The largest one for Melinda and her children. Right next door was a lovely home for Flora and her children. The house on Provo Bench was used mainly in the summer months and was smaller and not elaborate. Nevertheless, it was well built. All 3 houses are still nice homes and are still being lived in 1972. So it makes me wonder if they're still there today. During the winter months, Coleman usually allowed someone to live in the farmhouse at no charge, just taking care of it. An interesting story, supposed to have happened about this time concerning Coleman's orchard, is given by the descendants of William Coleman Boren, as he remembered the story told to him as a boy by Flora, his mother. Coleman was about to leave his home and was confronted by a large band of mounted Indians waiting in the front yard. He recognized the leader of Walker, with whom a treaty had been made only weeks before. Walker held in his hand a large juicy peach, evidently picked from Coleman's orchard on the bench. Coleman, who supposedly spoke the Ute language, inquired of Walker as to his purpose for calling. "You tell Wakara what is this?" the chief asked him. "Certainly," replied Coleman. "That is called a peach, and they grow like the rocks of the mountains in the far east from where I came. Is peach good for Wakara can eat?" Coleman assured him that it was so. The chief slowly took a large juicy bite, and juice ran down both sides of his mouth. His braves watched him wide-eyed, and their lips smacked as a look of satisfaction crossed their face for the chief. "Peach heap winnow, peach heap winnow." Okay. The peach said it meant it was very good. "You trade with Wadara Coleman. You let Wakara have pecha. I trade you good meat. Is this This is good with you, Coleman? Coleman agreed, and it would be nice to have venison in the house. And if Walker would bring him nice venison, he could have all the peaches he could carry. With a whoop and a cloud of dust, the Indians whirled and rolled out. Within a few hours, were back with a large deer and dropped it on the doorstep. Wakara now have brought Coleman meat. Coleman say okay for Wakara to have pizza now. Coleman agreed that it would be all right, but he wanted to ride out with Walker and his men to show them which should be picked, and for this they were all agreeable. When they arrived on Provo Bench, Coleman pointed to a large orchard from which the majority of the fruit had been taken, but on which trees many peaches still clung. You and your braves may have all the peaches that you see here, but not in the other orchards. Coleman told them, and if you agree to bring me one venison for every visit, you and your braves may have this orchard for your own for the rest of the season. Walker and his men agreed, and with a flurry of shouts charged upon the grove and began to devour the ripe fruit. The scene was one to stir the imaginations. Indians who had never tasted this fruit before gorged themselves with exclamations of great delight. After eating their fill, they began to pack the ripe peaches into bags and pouches, cramming them in so tightly that they easily crushed and juices came out the bottom. As they rode away that afternoon, Coleman vowed that it was an experience he would not soon forget. Life for Coleman and his two wives were plain old hard work. Melinda's older children were teenagers and they could help. They arrived in Utah in late 1851 with what could be carried in 3 wagons. No many paying jobs were readily available, and almost everyone around them in the same condition. Yet by 1857, just 6 years and a few children later, the family had prospered in a barren land. Many men at this time were rededicating themselves to the church by assigning their property to the church, and Coleman followed this example. This he lists and his total assets: peach orchard mainly, plus other family land, 2 horses, 1 yoke of steers, 4 cows, plus household furniture, etc., worth $2,055. A lot of money back in those days. The Utah War, or better known as the invasion of Johnston's army, briefly stated, on July 24th, 1857, while celebrating the 10th anniversary of their arrival in Utah, Brigham Young was informed that the United States government has sent an army with Colonel Albert Sidney Johnston to quell the Mormon uprising. Earlier in the year, there had been rumors of pending troubles, and all military districts were issued orders to muster companies of men to be placed in charge of seasoned veterans. In the Provo area were Coleman Boren and Moses Jones, both second lieutenants. The rank of lieutenant was given to the Silver Grays for men of age who had attained distinction for their ability to lead men as soldiers. This was a distinct honor. Orders were issued for the militia of various districts to furnish men to guard the passage into the valley of the Great Salt Lake. At Echo Canyon, and nearly 1,500 men answered the call. The men climbed the mountains at Echo Canyon, the places and places fire. Sorry, placed fires on the top with dummies sitting around the fires. Johnston's army thought they were many more men and entered the valley without a shot being fired. It turned out to be a blessing that the army came, as they brought clothing of all kinds of supplies and money which the people were badly in need of. According to William Coleman Boren, my father was a member of the Nauvoo Legion, and when they were called to defend Echo Canyon against Johnston's army, he went there to help. That was early in the spring of the year, and it snowed and turned to sleet and was very wet. My father came back from there with a bad cold and died from the effects of it soon after. He was not an old man. This is the story as I remember my mother, Flora, telling it. Formal death, as listed by Dr. John Riggs, was Coleman Boren, born 11th October 1808 and died 12th of May 1858. Only 50 years. Good heavens. At home of Melinda Keller, wife of Black Jaundice. For a physical description of Coleman, we again go to his son, William Coleman Boren. My father was not a tall man, maybe 5'9", but very muscular and strong. He had broad shoulders and strong hands. He was, I am told, a good singer. He wore a mustache much like me, although I never remember him with a beard. He was an excellent speaker with a strong voice and deep, piercing eyes. He had a dark complexion and I would say a distinguished looking, distinguished looking. He was deeply religious, and as children, we were brought up with the strictest obedience to his work and the gospel. We were required to have family prayer at every meal. Grace would be said. Father insisted that the table be set with the backs of the chairs against it, and my mother did this, and we were required to kneel at the table with our hands upon the children. I'm sorry, yeah, kneel on the hands upon the children. Kneel with our hands upon the seat of the chair and folded to say grace. We still practice this at my house. My father demanded the strictest obedience from his children at all times, and as I recall, he told us nothing more than just once. He was very moody, and the family still shows this trait quite a bit. I think often he would not say a work to anyone for days, but he was kind, considerate father and was known for his generosity. In fact, he was generous to a fault. Although I was only about 6 years old when he died, he was such a figure of a man that I shall never forget him. The last tradition that exists in the family that as yet has not been proven or refuted. That is, Brigham Young stayed for a time at the Coleman Boren home in Provo. Brigham Young did go to Provo several times during the 1850s. Also, he was in Provo in the month of May 1858. His headquarters during this time was on the public square where he occupied many buildings. One as the residence, however, he frequently stayed, especially upon first arriving in Provo, at homes of various friends. The obituary notice in the Deseret News, Volume 8, page 60, states, in Provo City, on the 12th day of May, Coleman Boren should be born, age 48 years, 6 months, and 29 days, died. Mr. Brother Boren was born in the state of Tennessee and was baptized in Union County, state of Illinois, January 3rd, 1840, by Zachariah Wilson as the missionary. In the city of Nauvoo, he was ordained at 70 and organized in the 21st Quorum. He moved to this place in the year 1851. He left the oldest, finest peach orchard that we have noticed in Utah County, evidencing among numerous like testimonies his laudable zeal and successful efforts for improving our otherwise bare valley. He left 2 wives and 14 children to mourn his loss. And mourn him they did. Never had a family been so lost as this one was without their beloved patriarch and father. He who had held them so closely bound together was no longer with them, and they began to drift apart. Patiently lovely, ever faithful Melinda became the bulwark of the family problems, much older than Coleman's second wife, Flora Marie, was almost 21 years younger than her husband. Melinda took on the responsibilities of business and finances. The two women lived together as sisters, and a bit later lived in separate houses, but near each other, and very little strife has ever passed between them. Whenever I whenever it did, the kind but wise other and very little strife had ever been kind of I'm sorry. Whenever it did, the kind but wise, stern when necessary, council of Coleman soon had matters in hand. But now he was gone. Family members have said that Melinda divided the property equally with her younger sister, right down to the last teacup. It must have been hard for Flora Marie with so many little children, 5, because the last of Coleman's children was born to her in 1858. The exact date uh, of Manasseh's birth does not seem to be recorded. In the Wasatch County records, we were told that Flora became a plural wife on August 2nd, 1862, of Robert Broadhead. There were 5 children born of this union. Flora died on May 5th, 1880, and on her tombstone it says at her age was 53 years, 11 months, and 22 days. She is buried in the Broadhead lot at the Heber City Cemetery. Melinda passed away on May 31st, 1872, at the age of 68. The events of that day are recorded by Lucinda Meekum Boren. Jasper was working at the mouth of Provo Canyon. He was getting ready to go see her when the word came that she had passed on. She had been sick for a long time. That morning she felt so much better. Lorraine was combining I'm sorry. Lorraine was combing her hair when Mother Boren said, "I believe I will go see Jasper and his family and stay 2 or 3 days. I will go and get ready." Soon she called and said, "Lorraine, I am dying," and within 5 minutes she was dead. She died of travel rheumatism and went to her heart, or that went to her heart. Oh, it's just so sad. Okay, well, if you're still here listening, thank you so much. There's a lot of information in here, and I do appreciate the Coleman or the Boren family compiling this. And one thing I learned is, it seems like this is a combination of many thoughts and ideas, many histories given by other people. And when we do our history, or what we should do with our history, is even those that are living, talk to them and get their stories, because you never know. Maybe someday someone down the line might want to read it. And with that, thanks for joining me, and we'll catch you next time. Bye.